Hi and welcome to this third episode of my knitting podcast. My name is Petra and I like to knit vintage patterns, mainly from the 1930s through to, I must admit I do like the 1980s, but I'm not so keen on 60s and 70s, so I guess 1930s through the 1950s, plus a bit of 1980s thrown in. It's been about 5 weeks since I last recorded a podcast. I am certainly not as fast a knitter as many of you guys out there. I've got quite a busy work life and I've got kids as well. So for me, 4 to 5 weeks is about as long as it takes for me to create one project. So I can do about one project per podcast, most likely. Anyway, so I am wearing a finished object today. This one is my 1930s jumper from the Table Talk publication, which I got as a PDF from Subversive Femme on Etsy. And it was from 1933 and it's knit as mesh on the top and ribbing at the bottom with Intarsia on the front, back and on the sleeves as well. And last time I talked to you about this, I was running into some dramas because I had run out of yarn around here, and actually I might go grab some of the yarn that I dyed up shortly, but I tried a whole bunch of different I tried re-dyeing the yarn again. I eventually got some yarn back in. Originally, when I ran out of yarn, the yarn that I had dyed was out of stock, so I had to wait for that to come into stock, and then when I dyed it, it ended up all sorts of different colours, so that was a little bit frustrating, but eventually I managed to get the right colour, and I think that I've done quite a good job. You can't really tell that it's different. The only difference really is there's a little bit more white patches, I think, on the shoulders compared to the front, and so I can see a few little kind of white spots around the place. On the back of the collar there's a little white spot which I use to tell which side I like to be back and which side I like to be front, but actually they're exactly the same. There is no short row shaping or anything like that at the back. It just comes down to which side I prefer, and so I could wear it in either way and it would be absolutely fine. So with this particular pattern, it's knit bottom up, and when I first started knitting it, it was funny. So I increased the number of stitches wide by 20%. I think it came to 22% actually, so because I needed a bit more width. So I increased the number of stitches, and I thought, I prefer a longer garment anyway. Someone who's a 32-inch bust, which the original pattern was for, is probably a lot shorter than me, so I decided to increase the height by 25% as well. And then when I got partway up the body, I thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be so long. As it turns out, I'm happy with the length now, but I was looking at it thinking, this is going to be so long, and I was worried that it wasn't going to go over my hips. Now that I'm wearing it, I realise that shouldn't really be a concern, because when you have so much ribbing, it stretches a lot. So stretching over my hips was absolutely no issue. But in any case, I was worried that it was going to be much too long. So when I got up to the mesh section, I decided to knit it as written. So I did not add extra length to this half, which means that it is a little bit tight under the underarm, just because the height from underarm to shoulder is probably a bit less than it should be, and it would have been better if I just added an inch or so of height just so that I had a bit more under here, because it is a little bit limiting in terms of what tops I can wear it with. I can't have anything that's too baggy under the underarm. And then so essentially I was worried that it was too long and that I was going to have a much too long garment. So I knit the top half of it at the normal height. And then when I got to the sleeves, I remember commenting to you that it was so hard to work out what the gauge was going to be, because if I increased the sleeve by the 25% as well, my concern was I was going to end up with really long sleeves. Plus also I was running out of yarn. So I recall saying to you guys that I was going to knit the sleeves as per the original pattern instead of as per my extended one. And yes, I ended up doing that. So my striping on the sleeves is actually smaller. The stripes are smaller than the stripes on the body, whereas they're supposed to be the same size. But as it turned out, I ended up with these really short sleeves. So I'm calling this a design feature. I'm calling it bracelet length, maybe slightly shorter than bracelet length. But I have decided that this is going to be an autumn jumper. And so far everyone who's seen it has not said that the short sleeves distract from it. And in fact, when I'm wearing it, the sleeves cut at about the same point as the bottom of the jumper, so it actually looks intentional. But I must admit, I was intending to have long sleeves, and I did keep kind of pulling on the sleeves a bit because I was not expecting them to be this short. And this was even after calculating the gauge, and still it ended up much too short. So there you go, sometimes gauge lies, and yeah, it is what it is. So back to the drawing board. It probably would have been good for me to have gone with the 25% extra on the arms as well after all. And if I stand up, I don't know if that will all get in, but I think that this actually cuts at the perfect length now with that 25% increase. So moving forward, I will continue adding the additional height, and 25% is probably good for me because I'm 5'7.5", 5'8", and I don't think many of the women with the 32-inch bust would have been that height. And yeah, I don't really like having things sit right on my waist. I like to make sure that if I'm wearing jeans that there's not going to be that bit of midriff hanging out. I'm not really keen on that. So anyway, I'm happy with my finished project, other than the occasional pulling on the sleeves, but I'm sure I'll get used to that. And come autumn, spring weather, it'll probably be nice to have a little bit of wrist exposed anyway, because you don't want to get too hot. Alright, so other than finishing this, oh actually, and there's something else about this one. So this has saddle sleeves, you can see them, but this, I basically had to seam the sleeves on here, and then it goes down like raglan style, I guess, from the saddle sleeve. And it was interesting, I had so much trouble binding off this neck because the pattern tells you to pick up 200 stitches, and I looked at the original pattern and 200 stitches was actually the same as the total number of stitches around the entire bottom. So yeah, the number of stitches in the neckline is the same as the number of stitches around the hips. Anyway, I couldn't pick up, because I had expanded mine by 20% or so, I actually had 240 stitches around mine, and I couldn't pick up that many stitches, but I could pick up 120 stitches. So what I ended up doing was I picked up 120 stitches with a very small needle. I think it's actually turned out really well, you can't really tell, but I picked up 120 stitches with a really small needle. I tell a lie. The pattern does not get you to pick up any stitches at all. The pattern actually asks you to cast on 200 stitches, knit a tiny piece, and then sew it on with a sewing machine. Now, I don't really have a sewing machine, not one that works anyway. And even if I did, the thought of sewing on with a machine a tiny little piece onto my knitting, really don't like that at all. So actually that was my decision to pick up So yes, I picked up 120 stitches around with a small needle, and then I did a knit front and back loop on every single stitch, which doubled the number of stitches, and then I did my ripping from there. But I moved to the same size needle as the ripping at the bottom, so I didn't do all of it in the smaller needle. But then when I came to bind off, there were just so many stitches that every bind off I could think of was making this really ripply fabric. It kind of almost looked like a frill. And the original pattern said to bind off loosely, so I was trying to bind off loosely and it just wasn't working. And I thought, well, given the number of stitches, I actually wasn't having trouble getting it over my head. So I thought, well, why even bother binding off loosely? So first I tried doing a super stretchy cast off. It was horrible. Then I tried, so I was still thinking about loosely. So another way that I sometimes bind off loosely is every fourth stitch, which I try to make a purl, I increase by 1 in the row beforehand. So I tried doing that, and then I ended up with just way too many stitches, and again it was just really frilly. So I thought, no, I need to do the opposite. I need to bind off more tightly. So I tried binding off every stitch as per normal, was still way too frilly around the neck. So then I tried binding off 2 stitches at a time and then 1 separate stitch, and again that was still too loose. So finally I settled on binding off 2 stitches at a time. So I'm basically doing a knit 2 together and a bind off in the same stitch, and that worked out perfect. I was really happy with that. So I kind of thought it was ironic that I ended up doubling the number of stitches that I picked up and then binding them off 2 at a time, but I think it sits really well. So whatever I did worked out. It just took a long time to get there. Alright, I am going to just pause for a minute and come back because I'm going to bring some of the extra yarn that I dyed to show you how widely different colours I ended up with. Alright, I'm back. Now, I ended up knitting up dyeing quite a few different shades before I settled on one that was going to actually match this. And I thought it was going to be simple because I had used Rit dye. And so Rit dye is already mixed up, so I didn't have to worry about actually making up a colour with powder. But despite that, it was still a little bit complicated, and partly I did a few mistakes that were really silly. So I hadn't told you what yarn it was either. So this is Bendigo Woolen Mills Luxury 4-ply. So I've got the black one, and then this one is Frost. So I haven't used this ball at all. You can see what it looks like. Now Bendigo Woolen Mills Luxury comes in 200 gram balls, so it's really good value for money. And I've actually been recommending it for people that are not Australian as well, because with the Australian dollar as low as it is at the moment, these are such good value for money, and they come in really solid shades. So anyone that's looking for solid shades of yarn, these are a really fine micron merino, pure merino. Anyway, so I ended up getting 600 grams of this because then I was going to get the free shipping. And it's lucky that I did because I ended up dyeing quite a few batches. Now my first attempt was this one, and I just dyed it too dark. So yeah, it would have really stood out. Too dark. So I went back to the drawing board and I ended up with one that was too light. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but this is actually a totally different colour as well, because first I used the Rit dye, which made it this kind of purpley grey, and then I saw that it wasn't right, and I can't remember exactly why, but no, oh no, it wasn't this one. I think it was this other one. So that's right. So this one ended up much too variegated. And also too dark as well. It was too dark and too variegated. And I thought, well, I'm not going to use this because it was variegated. And I wanted to just test actually, because I had been looking at natural dyeing, and I saw that you could dye with eucalyptus. And I thought, well, I'm not going to use this anyway because it's turned out variegated. I want to over dye it with eucalyptus. Now, as it turned out, the eucalyptus that I had just made it go very yellowy, and it changed from like this, it changed from a purple grey to like more of a greenish grey. It's actually a really nice colour. I like the colour of this. And in fact, I'd say that this grey goes with more of my clothes than the purpley grey. So I'm like actually happy that I made this colour. And for some reason it did fix the variegation. So I don't know why I thought it was too variegated, because looking at it now it's not. But I had also made this one too light, and I had decided I was going to darken it because it was actually lighter than this. I decided I was going to darken it. But somehow a little bit of the eucalyptus must have still, honestly I don't know. That I was sure that I had rinsed out the pot, but somehow after I over dyed this one again the second time with a little bit more of the Rit dye, it came out that greenish grey instead of the purplish grey, and I was gobsmacked because I swear that I thought I had fully rinsed out the pot. So now I have a purpley one, a darker grey and a lighter grey, but none of them the same shade of grey as this. So luckily, fourth time lucky, I ended up with this one, and it was slightly more variegated than I wanted, but by this stage I'd had enough, and I thought actually this was quite a close match, so I was happy. Yeah, and I've still got one more ball of the frost that I might dye again some other time. I do like dyeing my own yarn. I prefer dyed yarn over commercially bought yarn because I do like having that little bit of change in there rather than it being all solid. And luckily I know that I can get more of this particular shade easily enough, so I can just buy some more later and make something else out of that. I don't think there's anything else I need to tell you about this particular project. No, I think I'm all good. Alright. So, in terms of what's on the needles, so I was getting a little bit fidgety, I guess, finishing this up. I wanted to cast things on, and also I mentioned, I don't know if it was the last podcast or the one before, I mentioned that I'd wanted to learn continental knitting. Now, I had actually tried doing continental for a project at that time, the one that I frogged, and came to the conclusion that I didn't really like it. Yes, I probably need to persist with a whole garment, and I do use continental style knitting when knitting colourwork, although I'm not hugely experienced with colourwork. I did knit that colourwork hat, but I'm quite slow still. But the thing that I didn't like about knitting continental was I didn't like having to, I didn't like the fact that when you tension the yarn in your left hand, the yarn's pulling to the left, so then when you pull the needle out towards the right, it's harder to just catch. I found that it was harder to catch the yarn and pull it through. I guess I'm not used to that picking style, but it wasn't so bad on the actual knit stitches, but with purl stitches I found that my tension was getting really loose, and normally my tension is quite consistent between knitting and purling, and because I do knit quite a few vintage style garments, a lot of the time I don't knit in the round, I knit back and forth, and I don't want to have different sized stitches between my knit side and my purl side, and I was finding that really frustrating, and I just didn't like the process of purling, I guess, was mainly the thing. And I did hear quite a bit that a lot of people that knit continental don't like purling. So but I guess the reason that I had wanted to learn continental was I'd really like to knit a little bit faster. I had been measuring, and I know that knitting speed doesn't really matter, it's about the enjoyment you get from knitting, but I would also like to just knit more things. So yes, I would like to knit a little bit faster. And I had measured how quickly I knit, and I feel like I'm really on the slow side. So my knit stitches were about 30 stitches per minute, and so basically I just had a 200 stitches worth of knitting, and I just knit the whole thing, and then I worked out how much time it was, and came to the conclusion it was about 30 stitches per minute. And then my purling was about 20 stitches per minute, so a bit slower on the purling. But overall, I felt like that was fairly slow speed, which it said was, I did a bit of reading, apparently if you're a new knitter, then that's quite a reasonable speed, but I'm not a new knitter. I'm kind of new in that I had a hiatus for about 10 years, so I've only been knitting about 9 months. 9 months since my hiatus. So I guess I'm new in that regard, but I'm not actually a new knitter because I used to knit quite a bit previous to that hiatus. So I would like to be able to pick the speed up. So rather than trying to do continental, I went into my cupboard and I found this knitting belt that I had purchased from Shetland. So it's an authentic Shetland knitting belt. It's made of leather, it has horsehair in it, holes in there, it's been stitched all the way around. It has a very long adjustable strap, so it fits pretty much anyone. I can wear it over normal clothes, or I can wear it over my dressing gown, which I tend to wear quite a bit since it's been really cold over winter. And you just put it around your waist like this. And then with the knitting belt, you use double pointed needles. So you get these long ones, they go into the hole like this, and you actually keep this side, basically it stops it from moving around, and then you move the left needle and you keep the right needle fixed. Now when I knit with circulars actually, so initially it took me a little while to get into this style, because when I knit with circulars I actually tend to move my right finger quite a bit, and I actually move this needle up and down, and I actually tend to keep my left needle fairly still, so I tend to be doing this movement. Whereas when you knit with the Shetland belt, you keep this one still, and just pull this needle out. Initially I started doing this, which was like, felt really uncomfortable for me, but then later I realised that it was more efficient to use this kind of motion. So it's more of a, up and down rather than pivoting. So I've been using these, now I'm going to struggle to know which needle's which. I have to use my, that goes with that one. I've been using these on my last 2 projects actually, and I've been quite enjoying it. I've enjoyed using the knitting belt. I guess one thing I have to say with regards to the knitting belt is if you're sitting in an armchair, you do tend to hit the armchair with your left needle, and similarly with knitting in the car, it's not that convenient for the car. So I've ended up now with 3 projects on the needles, because I've got one on a circular needle that I can take with me in the car, and then 2 that I'm doing on my knitting belt that I only really knit in the evenings after the kids have gone to bed and on weekends anyway. So they're my kind of at-home knitting projects, which I'm doing on a belt. So I'll show you those. Now the first one that I started hasn't had as much love recently, but I don't think you've seen this at all. And this one's an Intarsia project. I think it's pronounced Intarsia, but to be honest, I want to call it Intarsia, but I think it is actually pronounced Intarsia. But then I have seen other people call it Intarsia as well, so I don't think it really matters, whatever you call it. So, with this particular one, I'm using yarn that I got as souvenir in Japan, and I got these for about $25 Australian per ball when I was in Japan, but I've since priced it up how much it would cost me to import it into Australia directly from Japan. It was going to be about $50 Australian plus shipping. Is that right? I think it was $49 a ball. So buying it in Japan was about half the price, and I'm unlikely to be going to Japan again anytime soon just to buy some balls of yarn. So what that means is that I must use these 3 balls of yarn and no more. So you can see I've got this lovely heathered dark green, and it is quite heathered because it's 60% wool. Oh, actually I should tell you what it is. It's called Amarisu and it's called Parade, and it's 60% wool. And then, oh, I can't remember the exact combination. I've got the tag here. So, it's in Japanese. Here we go. 60% wool, 20% cotton, 10% silk, 10% linen, spun and dyed in Japan. And there's 420 yards or 384 meters to a 100 gram ball. So yes, I got 2 of the dark green ones and 1 of this beautiful emerald green, which I really love. And so because I have to use these 3 yarns and absolutely no more, what I decided to do was, instead of knitting the ribbing, I did a provisional cast on, which I've never done before actually, and I'm thinking that moving forward I would like to do a provisional cast on for more of my vintage knits, because I like the idea of knitting down afterwards and then I can try it on and see where it sits against me. So I've essentially just started at the waist with no ribbing, and then it goes into this Intarsia section here. Now I have made a mistake, because when it first gets you to start with the Intarsia, it actually asks you to do a purl, and when I had done this jumper, when I had a purl at the join between the Intarsia and the mesh, it just looked really messy. I hated having the purl at the join because you could see the yarn changing over. You could see the colour change basically, and it tells you to start with a purl on the right side, and I thought, oh, this is going to look horrible. So I decided to do a knit on the right side instead of a purl. And then later on I realised my mistake. I'm not sure if I want to frog it though, but on the pattern, no, I don't have the pattern here. I'll look into inserting a picture of it. But on the pattern you can actually see a purl stripe that comes through here, and that comes about because there's a different combination of knit and purl. You end up with the purl on the inside, whereas on mine I end up with a knit on the inside, and so that stripe's missing. And that did add a nice bit of texture. On mine instead, I've got the texture on this outer section instead of on the inner section. And in hindsight, that's not as good, because after you finish knitting it, you actually knit on a frill that just covers the edge. So I might even frog this now that I think about it. It's only a small amount. I might actually frog this and go back to the way the pattern was written to start with the pearl. And even though it's going to look horrible at the edges, it will look nicer having that stripe on the inside. And I'm always probably going to look at it and wish that I had done it as per pattern if I don't fix that. So yes, I think I've talked myself into fixing it and just frogging back a bit. Now what I'm planning to do as well is I'll also knit the, I'll start the sleeves provisionally as well. And then that way at the end, however much yarn I've got can go into the ribbing for the sleeves and the bottom. And I won't have to worry about running out of yarn on the sleeves. Fingers crossed. Now the actual pattern for that came from the same Table Talk booklet that this pattern came from. I've only got a digital version, but I'll see if I can insert a picture of it. Alright, the next thing I've been working on is a little bit cursed. This one's been my car project, and I showed you before that I had finished some sleeves, and the actual project is a 1980s Cruchy cardigan, which was originally done in DK, but I changed the size to use a 4-ply. And I had done the sleeves fit fine. I've tried them on, they're all fine. And I came to knit the front, and actually I noticed this actually just when I was editing the previous podcast, that I wasn't going to have enough yarn at all to finish this. So I've done 2 sleeves. I came to knit which one's the front? That's the sleeve. This is the front. I came to knit the front. I weighed this, and I weighed how much yarn I had left, and I do not have anywhere near enough yarn, so I've only got that much yarn left, and I have to do another front plus the back plus the band, the button band that goes around it, and I do not have anywhere near enough yarn. I don't know what I was thinking. I don't know why I thought I had enough yarn. So I did have more of the exact same yarn, but in a totally different colour. I have it in this colour, which is as far removed a colour as you can get, really. But I had the idea that what I would do is I'd knit the body in this colour with the red sleeves on there, and then I'm going to do the button band in the red, and then I'm going to add some pockets in the red. So that's my new idea, and I think it's going to be okay, and I've definitely got enough yarn now. But oh, and the other thing is, because I had been knitting 2 strands of lace weight wool with 1 strand of this cashmere silk that I've got, I'd been wanting to use the cashmere silk up, and I really enjoyed the heathered look that I got from my previous finished project when I included the cashmere silk in there and then over dyed the project. So I decided I was going to do that again. But now I have this somewhat awkward situation where I have red sleeves, which when I over dyed that, I was thinking ideally I'd want to over dye that red. But then if I over dye that red, then this is going to end up with the white turning red and the blue turning purple, so it's going to look mild on the body and then not as mild on the sleeves. So what I'm thinking I'm going to do instead is I'm going to over dye the whole garment at the end, but I'm going to over dye it purple, and then I'm going to end up with both the sleeves and the body looking a bit mild, but One's going to be bluish purple and the other's going to be reddish purple because of the underlying yarns being different colour. So it's a complete experiment. It could turn out absolutely awful. We will see. We will see indeed. But I did like the resulting fabric that came from this combination of yarn and the silk in the previous garment that I made. So at least I know that the gauge and the fabric itself is nice. Now another experiment that I decided to do was, I think this project, it's not cursed. The project is not cursed, but maybe my experimentation can get me in a bit of trouble. So anyway, I decided that I was going to try a technique that I had read in a book from the 1970s, which was to knit around, basically knit in the round, and then when you get to the front, so I'm going to yarn buff, basically you can just wrap the yarn around about 8 to 10 times like this, and then continue, and then you can, it's a different method of steeking. You can essentially cut through that yarn and you can tie knots. And I thought that this sounded really interesting because this particular project has you knit on a button band which is actually folded, so it'll be attached at the front and at the back, and any loose strands are going to be entirely contained within the button band. And I thought, well, that actually, my dog's looking for a spot to sit and I've got my knitting everywhere. Alright, Denim, come here. You're okay. She's looking at me woefully. Alright, that's alright, I'll move. Yes, so I thought, well, it's going to be okay because all the knots and things are all going to be contained within the button band. So I proceeded to do this for a little while, and you can see I've got, sorry, it looks a complete mess, but I've got these knots that I started doing, and actually the knotting worked completely fine. I didn't have any problem with it. The problem that I did have though was I just didn't like the technique, because what I discovered was when you wrap it around and then go to knit, it's fine for that round, but then when you go to the next round, the tension on the edge stitches just goes really, really loose, and it's hard to even work out which stitch is the knit stitch and which was the loops that you had made yourself. And I was concerned that I was going to end up with the wrong number of stitches, that I was going to accidentally increase or drop a stitch. So I just didn't like the technique at all. And even though I did it for my first inch, I was just knitting back and forth, and then I had this idea. So I did that for about an inch with the knotting, and then I just went, to hell with it, and I just cast on some stitches and I decided I'm just going to steek it. So my plan with this, and I've never actually done a steek before, and I know it's not, I'm not using colour work or anything, but I actually thought, because I've never done a steek before, I wanted to try steeking where I wasn't doing colour work so that I could get a bit of a feel for how it works. And my plan is to just basically cut up the middle and then pick up stitches where it would have been the edge, and then I'm going to knit on that button band, and my button band is going to be 16 stitches across, and no, it's going to be more than that. So 8 for the cable to each side, so it's going to be 12. Yeah, so it's going to be at least 24 stitches for the edging anyway, and basically I'm going to knit it on one side, and then it gets folded around, and then when there's a buttonhole, you actually put the buttonhole on both sides. So you do 2 buttonholes, but then you fold it in half, and then you stitch it onto the other side. Does that make any sense? I guess we'll just see when it's done. But yes, This project's feeling a little bit experimental and cursed, but I'm persisting with it because this is my car project and it's just stuck in there going around and around and around, and you can't really go too badly wrong with it. Alright, got a lot of stuff everywhere now. Oh, this yarn really sticks to itself as well, which is probably good for staking, but it means that when I'm knitting with it, it tends to have pretty bad yarn baths. And also when I was trying to get this stuff into a ball in the first place, it just kept tangling and it was a bit of a painful process. So now I've got all of these little bits of, I've just got all these little bits of yarn that I haven't been able to get into the ball yet because they've actually tangled. So yes, I probably won't be keeping the scraps for this. Alright, the light just completely changed. Alright, the light went completely behind a cloud, so I've changed my lighting conditions. I hope it's okay. Okay, so I have one other project that I'm working on actively at the moment, and this is another, now that I've said that the light's coming out again, I thought it was going to be just really dark. Anyway, it'll be fine. So this one is a bit unusual. I think everything I do, I'm always trying to experiment as I do things, but I saw this yarn online and I don't know, I am not a crazy yarn person, but when I saw this yarn I just had to have it because I just really liked the colours in it, I guess, and I liked the fact that it was barber poling, and I showed it to you in a different episode, and I frogged my project when I was using it double, but I still wanted to see this knit up. So I decided instead of knitting it double, I would knit it singly and use one of my regular vintage patterns. So the pattern I ended up finding, because it does knit up at a larger gauge, and so I couldn't use a normal pattern for 4-ply because it would have been too big. So I ended up using a kid's book. So this one has all patterns for children in it, and I found this pattern here which had exactly the right gauge for what I needed. And I decided that what I'm going to do is, I'm going to knit this, but I'm going to crop it a little bit. And also I'm going to add a ginormous bow because I just need a bow. Why not? Why not have a bow? Because I thought it looks a little bit plain on its own, so I'm going to add a big bow to it. And this one's knitting up fairly quickly because the gauge is a little bit larger. So in the last couple of weeks I've already knit one front panel. If I can figure out what that is. Alright, so that's this side here. It's really crazy yarn though. It's actually such a pain to knit with because it's really fluffy in places, and you just catch it's so easy to split stitches. So I don't know if you can see that, but it really is very lofty in some places, and yes, can be very irritating. I have a feeling it's going to peel pretty horribly, but I don't know, I just wanted to see it knit up. I probably won't use it again after I finish this project. If there are any leftovers, I'll probably just give them away. Or I guess I could knit a matching beanie if I'm really so inclined, but it's colourful. And I'm knitting it using the Shetland belt, and it's coming along fairly quickly. So I don't think it's going to take me that long to knit this. In fact, I think this one will probably be finished in my next podcast, most likely. Unless it takes me a while to do the bow. Now, I probably should tell you what yarn this is. So this says Line Appio Italia, SPA Giotto. So this particular yarn, I got it on the cone from yarnsfromitaly.com, and then once they finished it, it was discontinued. I don't think it came back. So it was one of these situations where I knew I was never going to see it again, and I just really liked it. So it's 50% merino and 50% acrylic, 390 meters to 100 grams, and I think I got 400 grams of it on this cone. It was either 400 or 500. Alright, and essentially that's it for my works in progress, really. That said, I do have one other project here that I haven't shown you for a while, and it's my Ingrid sweater by Petite Knits, and I am not liking this project. I don't like the construction. I don't like this modern, this is not a vintage pattern. I don't really like modern construction because I don't like working on a whole jumper at once. And then the other thing was yeah, there's a few different things. One problem is I knit the smaller size, but then, because I didn't want it to be so baggy, but then when I knit the smaller size, it's got smaller sleeves. So the sleeves ended up a bit short. I actually need to re-hem it as well because my method of doing the sleeve ended up flared. So I need to redo that sleeve, but I've ended up with, I kind of feel like these sleeves are too short. I guess they're longer than this project though. They kind of sit at this awkward spot, so I think I'll just redo it and just add a bit of extra hem. It should be okay. In fact, it was looking a lot worse. It was looking like the sleeves were finishing there, but then when I blocked it, the sleeves did grow. But I guess the thing, I just find it sloppy, like big, and I like things to be slim fitting, so I'm not really liking it on. The other thing is I have to redo the bottom hem because the pattern tells you to do a Italian bind off, or tubular bind off I think it's called, and yes, it looks really pretty, but it took me hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, and then I discovered after I did it that I did it too tight. So I managed to undo half of it, but it took such a long time to undo. Then I ended up just binding off the other side, and it still looks too tight at the beginning, at the front, and then sloppy at the back, because I don't like it. I'm planning to just cut the whole thing off and redo the bind off. And the other thing as well is I ended up with this really terrible pooling. I don't know if you can see it, but it just pulls really badly at the sleeve, and I don't like that. In fact, I don't really like the whole colour. So I just haven't felt motivated to work on this at all, and it hasn't progressed much, although I think last time I showed you this there was no sleeve. So I guess I have done a sleeve, but that's been several months of just sitting around, and yeah. It's not one that I feel motivated to work on. Now in terms of what yarn I'm using for this one, it's discontinued yarn that was in my stash. It's really old, but it's a Morris & Sons, and it's an alpaca blend, and it's 4-ply, and I'm holding it double. But you won't be able to get the yarn again anyway, so don't worry about it. Alright, so that's happening on that, but that one's really slow. Alright, now I do have some knitting patterns to show you, and I mentioned before that I had got 35 patterns for $1 each, so I thought I'll just show some of the patterns. I just grabbed some of the ones that were on the top, so there's nothing, these are not my favourites or anything like that, but I do have plans to cast on one other project, and I'll show you the pattern there. So I think I will finish some of these projects before I cast it on, but for my birthday I got some DK wool, It was a Knit Picks bare wool because I do quite like dyeing, so I received 6 skeins of Knit Picks. Oh, I keep forgetting the name of it. Hawthorn. Knit Picks Hawthorn, which is a DK weight, and it's 80%. It's 80% wool. It's a kind of a rustic wool, but it's superwash, and 20% nylon in DK weight, and it's very high spin. It's got a tight spin on it. And I dyed it a rusty orangey colour. Yes, I dyed it a rusty orangey colour, kind of brown in some spots, orange in others. And I wasn't sure whether I was going to knit it up singly or whether I was going to pair it with something. But when I dyed up the yarn, I did make a mistake. So my pot was only large enough to fit 3 skeins of yarn in. So I dyed the first 3 skeins. So I made up the colour first. I made up 5 parts orange to 1 part blue in my green, what's it called? Yes, that's right, Greener Shades kit that I got for my birthday back in January. And Greener Shades doesn't have some of the chemicals in it that some other dyes do, so it's better for the environment. You just get these little pots and they don't have a lot in it each. But in any case, you mix up 1% dye compared to the weight of the yarn, and I had 600 grams of yarn, so I made 6 grams of dye, and 5 grams of that was orange, 1 gram was blue. I mixed it up and I thought that it looked a little bit on the yellowish side of orange, so I also added a tiny bit of red, mixed all that up, and I liked the colour. So essentially I stirred it all up, and as best as I could, I tried to get half into one patch and half in the other because my pot only fit 3 skeins of yarn. So I put half of it into the first pot. I put it in cold, let it soak up for a bit, and it turned out beautiful. The colour was absolutely beautiful. I put citric acid in at the end and then rinsed it all off. So it just came out really lovely. But I was a little bit impatient to do the second batch, and I didn't wait for the water to cool down so that I was doing it from cold again. And the other thing that I didn't do was, I should have just thrown out all the water and started again with cold water, but I didn't. I just thought, oh, that's okay, I can reuse the same water. And I completely did not consider that the citric acid will stay in the water, and thus the second batch is going to be hotter temperatures and with citric acid in it, which will affect how the dye takes up in the yarn. So my first batch came out more the way that I wanted, which was more of a tonal yarn. The second batch of yarn came out variegated, because when you put it into hot acidic water, whichever parts of the yarn go in first will take up more dye than everything else. And so essentially I ended up with a situation where now that second lot of yarn is going to have variegation, and it's going to have pooling and all sorts of things, which I didn't want. And I don't think variegation suits vintage patterns as well as a tonal. Although that said, there are some vintage patterns that are absolutely using variegated yarns, and I made a vintage top for my son 8 years ago using a combination of a really intense variegated yarn with a flat yarn, and it just looked gorgeous. I loved it. So yes, you can use variegated yarns on vintage patterns, but you don't usually see them like that, and I hadn't planned to make it variegated, I planned to make it tonal. So I was a bit disappointed because that was my mistake. And I thought, well, that's okay. What I could do is I could hold it with a mohair. It's really trendy at the moment to hold things with mohair, and I've never done that. So I thought, well, if I get a flat coloured mohair and hold that with the variegated yarn, and if I alternate skeins every row or two, then it will blend the variegation, and adding the mohair will also flatten out the colour so that it won't look as variegated. So I decided to do that, and I haven't been able to swatch it yet because it's still drying, but I did a bit of research into what the weight of the yarn is going to be after I add the mohair, and I've purchased the mohair now. And actually, with regards to purchasing the mohair, shout out to Knit Pearl Girl. I watched her podcast on choosing the right mohair, and thank you, that was so helpful. I've never used mohair before on a project, and I found just the right one. I was really happy with it. So when that arrives, I'll show it in the next podcast. But yes, she had a review on different mohairs, and it was really, really helpful. Alright, anyway, so I did a bit of research, calculated what the weight was going to be when I add the mohair to the Knit Picks Hawthorn yarn, and I've come to the conclusion that I'm going to end up with Aran weight yarn, and depending on the size needle that I knit it with, I might get... Okay, several hours have passed. My camera ran out of batteries. So I will resume where I was before. Sorry, probably the lighting has all changed. It is what it is. Alright, so I was telling you about these patterns. I thought I would just go through some of the patterns one at a time, rather than, I didn't want to show all 35 in one sitting because there's obviously too many, but some of these patterns I have are really lovely, so I thought I'd just grab some of the ones from the top. But this particular one I'm actually going to knit from this one next. So this is some glow. Oops. One of the previous owners of this booklet actually cut out a little bit of something from a newspaper and popped it in there too. But something that's really interesting about this particular one, I don't know if you can see, the gauge on these garments is really large, which is very unusual for a 1940s book. So this particular one, I'm assuming, based on the style, I'm assuming it is 1940s. This particular one, for example, is 16 stitches to 4 inches, which is very unusual for this time. I'll include some pictures here, but they're all about the same gauge. So this one down here is just an ordinary top, obviously a bit of stripes in it. It's just an ordinary top, but it actually has a gauge, this one, of 4.5 stitches per 4 inches. So essentially 4.5 stitches to the inch, so about 18 stitches for 4 inches, which is about equivalent to, I'd say, Aran weight wool. So that can absolutely be knit with modern wool. We don't have to worry about using all the old ones. I think this is going to be a little bit hard to see. I don't know if you can see that one. But all of these are all quite heavy gauge. Nice jacket. And this one on the top is my absolute favourite. So what I've decided to do is, with the hawthorn that I've just dyed, I'm going to hold that with mohair, and I'm going to knit this one here. And that particular project is 4 stitches per inch, so the equivalent of 16 stitches per 4 inches. And based on my calculations, I think that when I hold mohair with my DK yarn, and if I go up a needle size, I should be getting 17 stitches to 4 inches. So I've got a couple of different options. One will be that I just knit it as is, but go up another needle size again and basically gauge swatch until I get 16 stitches for 4 inches. Or the other alternative is I can just add another stitch repeat or half a stitch repeat on each side. So I might end up just doing that. There's one down the bottom as well. They're all the heavier gauge, and then 2 on the back. And yeah, I think this is one of the few one of the few booklets that I have, vintage booklets, that actually have quite large gauge at this set of years. Obviously they started going into larger gauge in the 1960s and 70s, but not so much 40s. Alright, so I mentioned as well that I was knitting a pattern from this one here. This is more for younger girls, but younger girls still have lovely patterns as well. So there's that one on the front. There's a lovely twin set. Now, one of the benefits of actually using patterns for younger girls is in the pattern itself there is a smaller diameter, obviously, being that it's for a child, but what it means is that you can knit these patterns in DK, and so you just need to work out what your gauge is and then see if that will fit you if you knit the same garment as the smaller one in the DK. So let's say it was 22 stitches to 4 inches or 10 centimeters in DK, then and this particular pattern uses 3-ply, and it says, does it tell us the gauge? Okay, so the actual gauge for this is 8 stitches to the inch, so 32 stitches per 10 centimeters or 4 inches. So what you can do is you can say 32 divided by 22 is whatever that is, and then you can multiply that number by the child's number. So if it was normally a 26 to 27 inch bust, then you can multiply that number that you did by dividing the gauges by the diameter of the children's garment, and you might find that that actually fits as an adult size garment but in DK. And so yeah, I actually really like this particular twin set. It's quite cute. I mentioned that I was going to be working on this one with my crazy yarn, and this is so cute, little child's version of a fuzzy Angora jumper. They seem to be all the rage. I've got a few pattern booklets for fuzzy Angora, and I guess you could probably knit them in mohair these days. So I don't know how much we have Angora yarn. I mean, I guess you can buy it, but it's just not that common. This one's actually a knitted dress, and it's really cute because it has the instructions down the bottom for embroidering it. It's super cute. I probably wouldn't. Some of these styles though do look a little bit childish, so in some cases you wouldn't necessarily make that for an adult if the style wasn't nice. But many of these, they would be fine for an adult. So that one there, absolutely cute. Again, it can be done in DK to fit an adult. There's just a few more in this booklet. And two on the back, a couple of lace patterns on the back. Oh, I don't know if I can see that. There. Might be a little bit hard to see that one. Alright, some of these booklets are a bit falling apart because someone's re-stapled them, but the original staples are falling out. So I got this Patons one. This one's a bit smaller, so it's probably a little bit harder to see. Some lovely, lovely cables on that one. This particular booklet has quite a range of different gauges in there, so I find they don't all use the exact same wool, so you do actually need to check the gauge on them. But absolutely gorgeous. I love vintage patterns. I'd like to make that one. This one does use a larger gauge of wool. So I don't know how I managed to get all these patterns with larger gauge patterns, but yeah, it's interesting. This one is really cute. Definitely like to make that one as well. There's so many things that I'd like to make. It's going to take me a while to do them all. I've never tried knitting a dress. I think that it would just take me too long. I'm not a very fast knitter. But I guess for some of these dresses you can actually convert them into a top just by removing the skirt. This one's gorgeous as well. I really love it. Really nice all over cable. Something I like about vintage patterns when it comes to cables is they do tend to do cables as an all over cable rather than just the occasional cable. And this is another fairly heavy gauge one. I think this one would work perfectly in DK wool. And that one actually already has by two different sizes. It's got a 34 and a 36-inch bust option. This one's actually really hard to see the pattern. I think it's just a bit of a checkerboard pattern with knits and pearls. And the look of it. I've knit a 1950s one that was like this before. It's one of those ones where you kind of knit it on the diagonal. But this one's different because they've gone with a completely different coloured sleeves. It's quite cute. So they've got white, they've done it in white and blue, and they've gone with white sleeves and white stripes with blue for the body. And this one is actually a 4-ply instead of a 3-ply pattern. So this is actually slightly thicker than usual as well. What have they said? 1 pattern to 1 inch. It's a bit tricky. Sometimes when they say 1 pattern to 1 inch, you really have to swatch it because you don't know how many stitches there are in a pattern. And you kind of get used to thinking of things in stockinette. This one's actually a 5-ply. So this particular booklet's also got quite a few of large gauge items in there. Just one more in this booklet. This one in the back. It's another lovely example of cables. I really like it. There's so many in this booklet that I'd like to knit. Alright, I'll just show you one more. Oh no, I've got 2 more booklets. One more. I think, are these? Oh no. Some of them are patterns and some of them are others. So this one's a patterns one. This one has some lovely lace projects in there. I just love this dress. Really stunning. I wish I could knit a dress. I don't think that I'll have the patience for that, especially not with kids around. This one's a beautiful lace project. It probably uses 3-ply wool though. Most from this era use 3-ply. Yeah, it's patterns crepe yarn equivalent to 3-ply. And then a jacket and a top. They're so sweet. I really love them. Alright, now these next 2 actually remind me of that really famous lavender slip stitch pattern. So both of these use multiple colours. Now the first one uses 3 colours. The second one uses 5 colours. can't really see what it's going to look like when we knit it up, but this is the 3-colour version, and that one there is the 5-colour version. And looking at it, I think they use slip stitches. This is just a basic top, but the styling is really lovely in the vintage ones as well, but just really basic. That looks like such a nice weekender. It's got an interesting collar. Okay, just 2 more on this. There's this lovely lace pattern. I have been thinking that I'd like to knit that one as well. I took a photo of that one for mulling over, and this jacket on the back. I've never knit a jacket, and I think it would be really practical to have something that looks more like a jacket. I like it how with the jacket they knit over the buttons so you can have everything match. Alright, just one more to show you. It's another Sunglow one. And Sunglow is an Australian brand, so it has quite a bit more lace, I guess, because especially if it's going to be a knitted t-shirt, we don't need a lot of warmth. So this particular one is all knitted t-shirts. So we have, how are we going to, I don't know if we can see that with the light. Gorgeous lace t-shirt. Just looks like it's got cap sleeves. And actually, interestingly on this, it looks like there's shoulder pads. Can you see that? There's like shoulder pads under there. Look how high off her shoulder it is. I find that really funny, having shoulder pads in lace. Actually, these all have shoulder pads looking at it, but that one just looks like she's off for the game of football. Look at this, all these bobbles. Can you see them? So many bobbles. Two gorgeous lace patterns. Yeah, the shoulder pads really look footballer in this booklet. Right. Okay, another. Don't know if you can see it. Lovely lace pattern, and that one's cables. This one, the picture's really small, but the lace is absolutely gorgeous on it, so I'll see if I can. I don't know if you can really tell, but the lace on it is just stunning. And there's one down here as well, little bowl arrow. And then on the back, this one's very similar to that kind of famous end of war sweater with the woman on the phone. I'm thinking it must be in Stitchcraft. But anyway, this one's very, very similar pattern. Alright, well that's all the pattern books I was going to show you today. And I don't think there's anything else that we need to discuss either. So, well, I guess that's the end of the show. So, yeah, really nice to see you all again. Please comment. I'd love to know that there's people out there that are enjoying the vintage knitting as well. I know there's a few channels on vintage knitting, but not too many. So please comment so that I know who you are, and subscribe. That would be wonderful. And yes, I'm looking forward to having a chat with you, and catching you all later. Alright, see you later. Bye.